Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Science Podcasts. This next podcast deals with energy flows. So, all organisms need to carry out activities. And those activities could be anything like moving or feeding, growing, reproducing, and as such, only plants are able to take energy from the sun. So most organisms can't use sunlight, and instead they need to eat organisms in order to obtain their energy. Now, since organisms will only eat other types, ecologists can actually trace the energy as it goes from organism to organism. And this is the concept of a food chain, which we'll look at right away. So since all living things require energy, the ultimate source of that energy is the sun. Okay, and producers, like this plant here, are able to capture sun energy and transform it into organic compounds. And these compounds are used to build plant parts, like leaves, flowers, or store energy in roots and seeds. The process that happens with this is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes solar energy and transforms it into chemical energy. Now, consumers, they can't use sunlight directly and transform it into organic compounds. So what they need to do is they need to obtain their energy from other organisms. And there's various levels of consumers. So there's primary consumers. Primary consumers are also called herbivores, and they feed directly on plants. So examples of herbivores, things like moose, cattle, grasshoppers. Secondary consumers, they will feed on primary consumers. And tertiary consumers feed on secondary consumers. These high-level consumers are also called carnivores. So both secondary and tertiary consumers are things like carnivores. Now, scavengers. Scavengers are a special type of carnivore, and what they do is they feed on dead animals. And humans, along with some other types of animals, we're omnivores. Okay, so we can feed at different levels. We can be classified as a herbivore if we're feeding on plants, or we can be a consumer, or we could be a carnivore if we're feeding on animals. So when we look at feeding relationships, these are also called trophic levels. Now, producers and consumers are linked in a food chain, which is really just a diagram showing how organisms feed. So the producers in this case, which looks like it's algae, is at the first trophic level. Now all of the primary consumers, so the organisms that feed on those or that algae, that's a primary consumer at the second trophic level. Now the fish, which will feed on the insect larvae that fed on the algae, that's the third trophic level. And then this ecosystem, we have a fourth trophic level, which are our tertiary consumers, which would be the fish. Different ecosystems can have multiple trophic levels depending on the amount of energy available. So animals will typically not just feed on one type of animal. Typically they feed on more than one. And this creates very, very complex food chains, which we can sort of group into food webs. So food webs show us how the sun's energy, because remember, in an ecosystem, all energy starts at the sun. It shows us how the sun's energy flows from producers to consumers to decomposers. Now, notice here that decomposers are sort of at the bottom, but there's this dotted line. And this tells us that decomposers can be found at all trophic levels because they break down dead and decaying plant and animal remains. Okay, so again, if we want to look at trophic levels, this level here on our food chain, that's the first trophic level. This one here is the second trophic level. Now notice that we have the third trophic level. Depending on what they're feeding on. They could either feed here, and this could be the third, or they could feed here, and this could be the third. So it all depends on the food chain that you're feeding on if we look at the different organisms. Now, the next concept that we're going to look at is ecological pyramids. And ecological pyramids are really just used to describe energy flow. And there's two main types of pyramids that we're going to look at. So the first of those pyramids is a pyramid of energy. So the pyramid of energy shows us how energy travels through an ecosystem. Now, because all energy originates at the sun, organisms will use energy for life processes like breathing, moving materials around, movement, reproduction. Only a portion of that is actually used to build organic compounds. Organic compounds such as proteins, such as sugars, such as fats, and things that we call, we'll call it DNA. So all of these four organic compounds are built from solar energy. So plants do that through photosynthesis. So as a result of this energy being used, only 10% of it is moved from one trophic level to the next. So in other words, as we move up the trophic level, there's less and less energy available. Now this will explain to us why we will only see typically 4 or 5 trophic levels. And depending on where we go, we may see some more or we may see less. So in the Arctic, where solar energy is very minimal, we're going to see less trophic levels. In the rainforest, where there's a lot of energy and a lot of productivity of plants, we'll see more. So here's an example of a pyramid of energy. And a pyramid of energy is measured in joules. So joules are our measurement of energy. And notice that as we move from the first trophic level and so on, only 10% of the energy that was available at the previous level is available now. That's different from a pyramid of biomass. Pyramid of biomass shows the living material at each trophic level. So we're not looking at energy transfers, we're looking at how much living material is available. The bottom of the biomass is bottom of the pyramid of biomass is the producer level. Now, it does not follow the 10% rule, okay, because we're not looking at energy. So in aquatic ecosystems, it would take a large number of producers to support a small number of herbivores. So we can imagine all of the plants and the plant material that's needed just to support a small population of moose. Also, if we compare the number of moose available to, say, a predator that would feed on moose, there's less wolves than moose, and it's not based on a 10% rule. So here's an example of a pyramid of biomass. And so you'll notice that at the bottom of the pyramid there's a lot of different plants that are available. In the case this is oak trees. So we find a lot of oak trees in a forest, and they would support a smaller number of caterpillars. Now there's still going to be more caterpillars than there will be this bird here. And finally, the sparrowhawk, which is at the top of the food chain, sometimes we call this our top carnivore. There's very few of them because they need to eat a lot of these birds in order to sustain one of them throughout their life. So that's energy flows, and I hope that was useful.